Now, you should all have got a copy of this, which is what I've written and produced primarily on trade. I've spent 3 months writing it and 4 years thinking about it. It began by being a leaflet, then it became a pamphlet, then a booklet, and now it's almost a dissertation. And I must thank Dorothy Baker for encouraging me to start, and also Steve Crowther for making sure that I actually finished. Now, we are UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which is what we are, what we always will be. But we could as well have been called the UK Internationalist Party. Some of our opponents call us isolationist. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is, in fact, exactly the other way round. They are the isolationists. They want the United Kingdom to become subsumed into a European superstate, a crypto airstrip one in a Eurasia. This is what Chancellor Angela Merkel, who was given the full red carpet treatment yesterday by the Prime Minister, wants for us. The fact is that Europe is not big enough for us, and the EU certainly is not big enough for us. And I think you can see this by this slide here. Now, our loss of sovereignty to the EU, open borders, and the rest are often justified on grounds of trade. So trade is mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, to get some facts into the discussion, exports to the European Union account for less than 10% of the UK's economy. In fact, as Roger Bootle said 2 days ago, it's about 8 to 9%. However, and this is a key point, 100% of our economy is subject to the burden of EU regulation. And when we talk about exit, we should always bear in mind that the glittering prize for UK exit is to relieve 100% of our economy and the 95% of businesses that do not export or trade with the EU from the burdens of EU regulation. Now, to trade. I am going to come up with a revelation that for the Nick Cleggs and Peter Mendelssohns and Michael Heseltines of British politics may be almost blinding. And here it is. The UK does not need to be in a political union in order to be able to trade. Now, here are 2 slides. Well, here's slide 1 of 3, actually. These show, it's described from the point of view of the European Union. What it actually is, it's the top 40 countries outside the European Union from which people and businesses located in the European Union take imports. Or to put it round, much, much simpler, exports to the European Union from countries which are not members of the European Union. Now, these figures are from Eurostat itself. These are, as it were, the very tablets from Mount Sinai. Now, at number 40 is the United Arab Emirates, where many years ago I used to live and work, and I will come to that a little bit later. And you will see that even the UAE, at number 40, exported 8.294 billion euros worth of goods. And here is the slide showing numbers 1 to 20. You will see the sheer volume of trade exports into the EU from countries which are not in the EU. And to drive the point still further, here is a simplified slide showing the top 10 in 2012, the most recent years for which we have figures. And off this slide, I'm going to make just 2 points. First, China, at number 1, sold just short of 290 billion euros of exports to people and businesses in the EU. And somebody should take Mr. Clegg aside and tell him that China is not in the EU political union. And second, what is noteworthy is the sheer volume of the exports of the top 10. If you add it together, it's roughly equivalent to the entire economy of Spain. Let me be crystal clear. A country does not have to be in a political union in order to trade. Not remotely, not at all. And we would absolutely not be turning our backs on EU markets when we leave the EU. That all trade would cease is simply not a tenable proposition. The facts are clear. This is complete rubbish, peddled by people who should know better. Specious nonsense, and worse still, it is a deliberate deceit that does not belong in British political life. In fact, there is no reason to suppose that any trade would be lost at all. Now, to the matter of the UK's trade agreements. We all know, but not everybody does, that since 1975, all the UK's trade agreements have had to be negotiated by the EU Trade Commissioner. He or she has to take into account not just our interests, but the interests of all 28 member states, and that is not to our advantage. It is also worth spelling out that the EU has agreements that encompass trade with over 100 countries. In fact, we've counted 126. Mexico in Central America and South Korea in the Far East are just two of the countries which have full trade agreements with the EU. After exit, a UK-EU trade agreement is inevitable. There will be one, and it will be tailor-made. But I must emphasize that it's not necessary for a country to have a trade agreement with another country in order to be able to trade. As we've just seen with China, China does not have a trade agreement with the EU at all. And in fact, what the asterisks show that out of the top 10, none of those 6 countries have got trade agreements with the EU. We don't need to have one. Now, it's often said that we should be in the EU because of influence, in order to influence what's going on. Now, let's see just how much influence the UK actually has in the EU. This slide shows the votes in the Council of Ministers. Yes, I think it does. Yes, here we are. We currently have just 8.24% of the votes in the Council of Ministers. And that proportion has been going down all the time. In 1973, when we joined, we had 17%, double. And as each new country comes into the EU, our proportion of the votes of the Council of Ministers goes down. Now, incomprehensibly and bizarrely, and against the UK's national interest, the 3 establishment parties are all cheerleaders for yet more countries to join the European Union, even and including Turkey. And by the way, the Conservative Party want Ukraine to join the European Union. Now, through you, I have the honour to be an MEP. Now, MEPs don't have really very much influence at all, but the CBI think they do. And let's just look at MEPs. You can see that in 1979, we had 19.8% of the MEPs in the European Parliament came from the UK. Now we have just 9.7%, and again, that will go down. In terms of commissioners, the UK, when we joined, we originally appointed 2 of 13 commissioners. Now we appoint just 1 of 28. Now, there was a slide on this, but I don't think I really have to say that the percentage of 1 of 28 is an awful lot less than 2 out of 13. And moreover, to make changes in the EU, it requires unanimity, the agreement of 28 governments of 28 member states. The facts are absolutely crystal clear, Mr. Prime Minister Cameron. Real change is impossible. Our influence is negligible, and the mantra of influence, 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 which we hear all the time, has absolutely no basis in reality. now I'm going to talk about free movement of people. Article 3.2 of the consolidated version of the Treaty of the European Union lays down free movement of persons, which is a fundamental principle, as Chancellor Merkel told the Prime Minister yesterday. In consequence, over 450 million people from the EU have the absolute right to live, work, and settle in the United Kingdom. There can sometimes be transitional arrangements, but these are by definition transitional. Now, free movement is often justified, for example, by Nick Clegg in the following terms, when he wrote in the Sunday Times: "Are we really that keen to see the back of German lawyers, Dutch accountants, or Finnish engineers?" But that is not the point at all. We are not talking about qualified people. We are talking about the absolute right of people, without qualifications, without skills, without means of support, to settle permanently in the United Kingdom. And those people, with the skills that our country might need at a given moment in time, should have work permits, just as I did so many years ago when I worked in the United Arab Emirates as a chartered accountant. We must be able to choose who comes to live in our country. And we cannot while we remain in the EU. Now, open trade, to put one misunderstanding right by many people outside this hall, open trade does not mean open borders. And by the way, in the North American Free Trade Area, which is normally known as NAFTA, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, there is no free movement of people. None at all. Now let me talk about the EU's share of global wealth. The EU's share of global wealth, defined as its share of world output, is in long-term decline. In 1980, the EU share was over 30%. Now, in 2014, it's less than 20%. And it's projected for 2039 to be less than 10%. And I must point out that the figures for the EU include the UK economy. Without us, these figures would be even worse. And the facts demonstrate it. EU membership is the economic equivalent of being chained to a dying man. Now let's talk about tariff reductions. There have been big tariff reductions since the UK joined the then common market in 1973. And this is the important point. To the UK, to be in the EU customs union is now worth a whole lot less than it was when we joined. Now, some people say that a country has to be in a large trade bloc in order to be able to sign trade agreements. The facts demonstrate that this is not true. In fact, it's the other way around. Switzerland, for example, has a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan. Switzerland has a trade agreement with China. New Zealand has a trade agreement with China. Iceland has a trade agreement with China. And the European Union has no trade agreement with China and no trade agreement with Japan. It's just not true, that. Now, the EU is currently negotiating a trade agreement with the United States. And it was put to me on BBC Radio that the United States would only be interested in signing a trade agreement with the UK if the UK were a member of the EU. And this on the grounds that the UK economy is too small. So I thought, let's look at the facts. The United States currently has trade agreements with 20 countries. Each one of these countries, the GDP is smaller than that of the UK. It is entirely clear a country does not need to be in a large trading bloc in order to negotiate trade agreements. Furthermore, it absolutely does not need to be in a political union, and that's what the European Union is. Ladies and gentlemen, the UK should leave the EU. We would thereby regain the ability to negotiate trade agreements for ourselves in our own national interest. The UK would then immediately reactivate our seat at the World Trade Organization. And to repeat what I said earlier on, our exit would then relieve 100% of the UK's economy from the burdens of EU regulation. To sum up, therefore, to trade and trade successfully, we do not need to be part of a wannabe European superstate. And what our opponents are offering is the politics of misrepresentation, of deliberate deceit, of groundless threat. In short, the politics of fear. We, in the UK Independence Party, are putting forward on trade, as well as in everything else, common sense, the politics of positive, the politics of answer, and the politics of the best way forward for the future of our country. And this is why I'm going to end as I began. The UK should be out of the EU into the world. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.